Okay, so this talk today is about Tailwind CSS and how you can use Tailwind CSS in Drupal. There will be a few live demos in it, so I'm living a little bit dangerously. So if you bear with me on those, that would be great. Just a quick bit about myself. My name is John Hume. I worked at the University of Dundee for 10 years. And then about 5 years ago, I branched out on my own and started All Star Solutions. And we do Drupal development and WordPress development. So what is Tailwind CSS? Basically, it's a CSS framework. You'll probably be familiar with things like Bootstrap and Foundation, and those have quite large component libraries. You know, you get navs, you get forms, buttons, and various other components. Whereas Tailwind is a bit more low level than that. It works on the premise of utility classes. So each utility class will apply certain styling to the element that it's added to. So this screenshot here is the Tailwind CSS homepage, and you can see in the code block an example of some of the utility classes. You have things like BG white, which turns the background white. Rounded is border radius, P is for padding, H and W are height and width, and that doesn't mean height 16 pixels, it actually uses a sliding scale. So you can do height 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it starts going up in bigger increments like 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 20, 24. And it's based around either M's or Rems, I think. But it's quite good. You tend to be able to pick a value on that that works with your design. So they've done it quite well in that regard. So the traditional workflow, this is an example of a chat notification box. What you do is you write your HTML, then you name your component and give it a class. Then you would name your subcomponents and give them more classes. And then you would jump over into your CSS and you would write out the styles for that component. With Tailwind, you're effectively skipping the CSS part. There's a series of these low-level classes that you sprinkle into your HTML, and those apply the styling directly. So there isn't really a need to write the CSS. I think it's worth just doing a quick overview of the pros and cons of Tailwind at the moment. So one of the pros is there's no more naming things. You know, you're not having to think up class names for everything, which is a biggie because no developer really likes naming things. It's standardized, so there's a standard set of class names, which is great when you're working with multiple developers or across multiple platforms. I find it useful to go between Drupal and WordPress projects that are both using Tailwind, because there's that familiarity between the two. CSS real precedence really becomes a thing of the past because you just add a class to the HTML and you're not having to add in CSS. You'll see things where people have added like 3 classes and an ID to create their CSS rule. There isn't any of that because you just add the class that corresponds to the CSS rule and it applies it. And it's easy to learn. You know, you could pick it up, the class names, in about space of about maybe an hour, or the basics of it. You'll be up and running with it quite quickly. The cons, it is a bit ugly. You know, it doesn't look pretty having so many, having all these class names sprinkled over your HTML. You look at it first and it just feels a bit wrong. Doesn't feel like best practice to be doing that. But once you get used to it, it's a great way of working. You obviously need control of your HTML to add the classes. I've worked in CMS before where you couldn't actually change the HTML, it came out and that was it. So, you know, for that kind of scenario, you wouldn't be able to use Tailwind. And the CSS file size by default, since it's covering so many different CSS rules and there's lots of different combinations of those, the CSS file size is actually pretty big that Tailwind gives you to begin with. But there is a solution with Purge CSS to solve that, which we'll discuss later. So the best way probably to see how this works is to just jump into a demo. There's a site here called tailwind.run, and it's like a CodePen type thing for Tailwind. So I've just picked part of the Drupal.org homepage, and the idea is that we could just go in and style it up. So looking at the mobile view first, Tailwind works on a mobile first basis by default, but you can change that if you want to do desktop first. You can change it, it's configurable, but by default it's mobile first. So the heading would need, it needs to be centered, so just add text, center, and it needs to be bold, font bold, and a bit of margin above and below, MY2, and maybe make the text a bit bigger, text large. Then the paragraph below just needs to be centered as well. The Tailwind also allows, it has functions for responsive classes. So it gives you certain prefixes you can apply for the rule to apply to just a certain breakpoint. It has 4 breakpoints by default: small, medium, large, and extra large, and that becomes the prefix. So if I move into the desktop view, and I want to style this for desktop, I need them side by side, so if I just add flex, and the MD prefix means from medium up. So I go back to extra small, it doesn't apply there, it only applies to medium up. And then you could refine it further, you know, if you want to make them evenly sized. And you could obviously add padding and tidy that up a bit more, but you know, it's fairly easy to quickly put together these styles. It does offer flex-based grids, and it's quite well documented. The flex-based grids probably solve much of what you'd want to do. And the documentation is very good. It's quite comprehensive for each of the different utility classes that you'd want to add. And it now also has support for CSS Grid. That arrived in version 1.2.0, which was just recently released. Similar to the responsive classes, it provides some pseudo classes you can use. So if you add a hover prefix and then the class, it will only apply that class on hover. So installing Tailwind. Basically, it's installed with npm or yarn. And there is a CDN version, but they don't recommend that for production use. You can't customize it at all. You'd be stuck with the fixed color palette that Tailwind gives you. You can't, you know, you're stuck with the same breakpoints, same widths, and that kind of thing. So it would be suitable if you wanted to do just a quick and dirty prototype. But for live projects, it's probably not the best. You probably want to install it. The second part of the installation is into your CSS. You add these Tailwind directives. And what these do is these just pull in all the Tailwind classes. So that's all that does. It pulls in all the Tailwind classes, and then it'll be output into your CSS files. And anytime you make a change to your Tailwind config file or that CSS file, you have to npm run to run your scripts, which generates all Tailwind's classes. So the other alternative, obviously, is if you want to use it in Drupal, there is a Tailwind starter theme. This has a lot of the config set up already for you, your npm scripts, so you can get going quite quickly with the starter theme. And incidentally, it was created by Oliver Davies, who's doing the talk next month. So the Tailwind CSS theme is based on Stable, which is one of the core themes, and it is quite a minimal core theme. There's a lot of default components don't have any styling at all. So things like your tabs for edit and view, the nodes, those aren't styled, your login page isn't styled. So you are going to have to add some of that styling in yourself. And there's a couple of notes at the bottom. You have to run npm install to pull in Tailwind. It's based off version 1.0.1, so it's not the latest. You may want to update that via npm when you first begin to use it. And there's these prefixes, sorry, the bottom two items, it adds a prefix of tw dash, which means you have to prefix every single Tailwind class with tw dash. And the reason for that was they were experiencing some collisions with .block. So this isn't required anymore. So the first thing I do when I bring down this theme is I go and remove them, because it's a bit of a pain to add tw dash to every single Tailwind class. It slows you down quite a lot. But you don't actually need these anymore since they moved to the stable theme. So you can just remove those. Customizing Tailwind. So there's a tailwind.config.js file, and it allows you to alter Tailwind's defaults. So Tailwind gives you a range of colors to begin with, but if you're creating a custom theme, then you want to use obviously the brand colors. You'll find elements on the page that you want to set your own max width. You may need your own breakpoint and that kind of thing. So that can all be done from within this tailwind.config.js. It's well documented on the site, and after you make changes to it, you just run npm run dev again, and that will be incorporated. And then any classes will then be available for use in your HTML. You can also add CSS into the CSS file. There are some elements that are not ideal for Tailwind, such as places where the site editor may be editing. You know, it's not practical for your site editor to go and adding classes to every single paragraph or every single link or every single heading. So it's worthwhile to add some base styles, and Tailwind gives you a way to apply the classes to the base styles, which we'll look at later on in a demo. The component section, you can create your own components. So if you had something like a button and it used about 6 or 7 different Tailwind classes, you could then just in your CSS file add .button and then apply all of those classes, and that allows you to use the button class in your HTML. So you can extract it into components. The utilities section, Tailwind doesn't cover every single CSS rule that exists. It covers a lot of the most used ones. So it does provide you the option to create your own. So if you find a CSS rule that Tailwind doesn't have in its framework, then you can add a new utility for that, and that will add it in, and you can then use those classes in your HTML. So the Drupal and Tailwind workflow, what does the development workflow look like? Obviously, Tailwind requires adding classes to your HTML, and this means that you're going to be overriding Twig templates, overriding your node, fields, etc. to add those classes in. There are times when the HTML can be quite difficult to access, and it can be quite difficult to figure out where the HTML is coming from. But you do always have the option. You could just add plain CSS into your CSS file if you didn't want to spend half an hour, figuring out where the HTML was coming from. So I'd like to do another quick demo. I'll give a quick overview of the Tailwind CSS theme in Drupal. And then we'll look about styling a couple of elements on a news article template. So this is just a simple news article I've got here. It's got a heading, an image, and some body text. So we can see here the Tailwind CSS theme. Just going to collapse these to begin with. The most notable parts in terms of Tailwind are the config file. So there's tailwind.config.js, and that's where you can add in your customizations. There's also in the source folder, you've got tailwind.css, and that's where these Tailwind directives are added. And the theme developer for the Tailwind CSS theme has added just a few styles in there to apply some Tailwind classes. And after you run npm run dev, it spits out this Tailwind dist/tailwind.css file, which contains all of the generated classes for Tailwind. And you can see there is a lot, 60-odd thousand lines worth. There's also this webpack.mix.js, and that's what the developer has used to run the script, which generates Tailwind classes. So if we look at the H1 tag on that article page I showed you, what are the options for altering the styling of that? Well, we could override the page-title.html.twig, but since it's an H1, you're more likely to be wanting to use that globally. So it's worth just adding a base style for the H1. And in Chrome, it can be quite handy to, if you select the element, then you have this class option on the right-hand side here. And then you can add your classes directly here. So if I want to make the text bigger, it gives you the suggestions as well. So it's quite useful. Margin bottom 4, and maybe make it indigo. And then we can copy those classes and move them over to our CSS file. The source folder and then the Tailwind file, and just add them below the base. So if I do H1 and then I use the apply directive and then add in my classes, and now I need to do npm run dev. Yep, so that's compiled, and refreshing the page, the styles remain. Another thing we may want to do is on the body, it's quite a long line length, so we may want to restrict that to a shorter line length to make it easier to read. So we could just set a max width, max W, 3XL, and that's a bit of a better line length for reading. So there's two ways we could go about, or there's probably more than two ways, but the two obvious ways to go about changing that, you could do it directly within the node article HTML twig. So if we look for that template, and then we can see that all the content is being output with the one tag. So we'd need to split that up if we want to use this method for styling just the body. You could do it this way. I mean, you'd need to add a wrapper div around it in order to add your classes. Not ideal. More HTML, but you know, it could be done that way. Or you could also, instead of using content.body, you could pull it from the node, so you don't get any of the wrappers and you just get the raw value. That's another option. Just add it now and go back to the page. Refresh, and the class has remained on the body. Another option, if you don't want the extra div, you could also override the field template. Remove this for now. Just add a new field twig file. I'm just going to grab the naming suggestion. We need to grab the default HTML for that, which will be in the base theme. So core themes stable templates field HTML. If I paste that into my field template, and there's a lot of if statements here because it's accounting for the fact that there may be multiple or there may be a label, but in our case we don't need multiple or a label, so it's fine to just remove the vast majority of this. We're not inside a loop anymore, so we need to change it to items.0. And then you can add the class, the attributes. Clear the caches. Okay, so we've not applied it for some reason. So I think I need to change this to 0 as well. There we go. So that's the other way you could add the classes into your HTML. So I just wanted to give a quick sneak preview of this module that I've been working on. I got a little bit fed up with having to override templates all the time. You know, if you've got a big layout and you've got a lot of fields in it, then you end up overriding quite a lot of field templates. So I tried to think up an alternative workflow that could be a bit more efficient. So what the Tailwind class injector module does is it allows you to specify classes from within a YAML file. So you could create a YAML file according to whatever the hook name is, and then the Tailwind class injector module will pull in all those classes and spit them out into the twig template for you. Let's switch to the right branch. Alright, so let's double check that this page still loads. switching between branches can sometimes kill the site. So yeah, there we go. So I'll do the same example with this body field and how we could add a max width to it. The way the Tailwind class injector module works is you add a directory in your theme called Tailwind classes, and then you add the YAML file according to the hook name. So in this case it's field, or it would be node or whatever you're trying to override or add classes to. So the workflow now becomes take your template suggestion. So debug mode's a godsend here. So if I edit the HTML, we don't want the .html.twig part, but we'll take the rest, and that becomes the key in the YAML file. I'm actually going to add a comment just to make it a bit cleaner. So once you have a lot of fields in the file, it can get a bit messy. So it's best to keep it alphabetical and comment it as well. Then you notice there's this attribute as well called TW class injector. That tells you the variable name that will be output in the twig. So this is Tailwind item. Sometimes there'll be one for a label, so you want to inject it into the label rather than the actual value of the field. And sometimes you want to inject into the wrapper. So there's different variables for each of these places that you could output. Just a case of adding that as a key, and then you just add a string with your class names that you want to add. And now if I refresh, you can see that it's injected the class into the HTML. So there's some support by default from Tailwind Class Injector for some hooks. If I can find the module, here we go. Oh, that's core, it's not core module. Custom, here we go, Tailwind Class Injector. So these are the templates it uses by default. If you don't like the HTML that uses, you can obviously override it yourself and change the HTML. But we can see it's adding these variables into the classes. You've got Tailwind wrap, Tailwind label, and also Tailwind content for blocks. The field one that we just looked at, it's very similar to the default field template, except that it's adding in these variables into the appropriate places. So I find that just to be a bit of a quicker way of working, and it keeps your theme a bit cleaner as well, because you're not having tons and tons and tons of template files. You only need to override a template file then if you want to change the HTML. I mentioned earlier that the default Tailwind file size after building it is huge. If I could find, yeah, so we see here it's 1.06 megabytes that is output, which for any kind of website, that's not going to give you great performance for your CSS to have over 1 meg of classes in your CSS. So there is a solution with Purge CSS, which is it's a utility that what it does is it will remove any classes that aren't used. So the idea is, I just wanted to throw some config out there. I mean, you probably have to play around with this a bit to get it to work for you, but basically in your webpack.mix.js file, you add these directives for Purge CSS, and you tell it where to look for classes. And what it does is it inspects those files, and any classes it finds, it leaves them in the CSS file. But anything that's not found is purged and it's removed. So I'm asking it here to look at the twig files and JavaScript files in case any classes are added from JavaScript, and also from the YAML files for Tailwind Class Injector. And what it actually done for me is it got it down from over 1 meg down to like 27 kilobytes, which is much, much better for performance. So in conclusion, can you really say bye-bye to CSS? Well, sort of. You still need to know CSS, and especially with a CMS, you know, writing a little bit of CSS is inevitable. A typical project might be like 10,000 lines of CSS, whereas my last project with Tailwind, I only wrote 300 lines of CSS. So it really drastically reduces the amount of CSS you need to write. I really enjoy using it. It's difficult to go back now. When I have to go back to a CSS site that's got tons and tons of CSS, I find it difficult to jump in and out of those projects. Whereas with Tailwind, you know what the classes are, so it's much easier. It's a lot more maintainable, I think. Thanks for coming along virtually. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah, I can see where it can be very important getting the templates right here. Have you ever hit problems with having to, if you're wanting to change margins, ending up having to go through a lot of template files or a lot of places to change that because you've embedded the class in the markup? Do you find it any easier or worse? So yeah, if you're wanting to, if you're going back to the site and wanting to change relative sizes across the board or margins across the board to give more white space to the feel of the page, do you end up making more or less changes? Do you have a feel for that in the work you've done?
It doesn't feel any worse. I think there's also an element of good planning beforehand. You know, so if you get your paragraphs right, and if you get, if you don't like duplicate codes like you otherwise would as well, you know, you're not going to have a lot of places. But I haven't come across that as a big problem, thankfully. Yeah.
Does the YAML files in your Injector module, is there inheritance there? So if you wanted to create a default field setting and then override it for a special case?
You can do that. So it works on the template suggestions, and it will look for the most specific one. So I could have a default, you know, field body, which would apply to all bodies. But then if I added field body node article, it would override it just for node article. So it tries to respect that.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Yeah.
It's still the module's still in the works a bit. I may throw it up as a sandbox just now, but it still needs a bit of development to make it ready. I want to make it possible for other modules to add their own template suggestions. A lot of modules don't actually use the core template suggestions hook. Even Views doesn't use it. So I had to go in and add the template suggestions for Views because Views doesn't use the core hooks. There is an issue open for that, but I mean, there's going to be a lot of other modules that are similar. So I need to provide a way for that, and the code needs cleaned up a little bit. But I am using it in my projects just now, and I intend to keep working on it as I work on my projects and add more functionality. So.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite curious, you mentioned the components, which sound, even before you mentioned it, I was kind of wondering if you could do that. Do you find you use that a lot? I mean, it struck me personally as something I'd lean towards, but how have you found that?
Yeah, for things like buttons, it is useful. Things that are going to be reused a lot, and you need to drop that, you know, that into various templates. It is useful. So what you would just do in your CSS, you could just add dot button and then do your apply whatever classes you want, and add in all your classes there, and then that just gives you button to use. So I haven't actually used it as much as I thought I would. Buttons are one example. I'm struggling to think of another good example where, you know, it's came in really useful, but because your other option is you could create partial templates and then just pull in your partial templates wherever you need them. Mm. And I think Tailwind came out of a guy who works with Laravel a lot, and obviously with Laravel you're hand coding your HTML, so you know, it makes perfect sense. But in a CMS, I do find that you probably need to jump into the CSS file a bit more. do a bit more work there.
And I quite like that. It's got a lot of parallels with how I work with SAS. So.
Yeah, I've noticed actually in some of my projects in the past, I started creating classes like float left, float right, you know, just little utility classes. So it almost feels to me like Tailwind's a natural, you know, progression and extension of that to its fullest.
It's also interesting to see that Bootstrap now has virtually all these utility classes in it.
Does it really?
Yeah, so certainly I can look at Bootstrap 5 more than anything, but I think it's in there in Bootstrap 4. But yeah, you've now got all the padding, top margin, top line, again, values which go up in steps and as a range, and setting text color and all the rest of it. So that just seems to be growing and growing, the range of utility classes they're putting on. And so they're obviously paying attention to this sort of way of working as an alternative to putting into the template rather than always having a style for it, a class name for it.
Kind of wondering if in like 5 years there'll be a, ooh, look, we've got this idea about semantic class names, or go that way.
Yeah, full circle.
Well, again, it's because now that you can do the atomic design, the componentization at a template level nowadays, whereas you were working with much bigger templates before, sort of allows you to go the other way with CSS.
Yeah, and CSS, I think CSS has got to the point as well where you have things like flex and grid, so there's less need for these kind of more bulkier frameworks that give you a grid system, and you can do most of what you need to do in the CSS without even really needing SAS that much anymore.
Have you ever done any work in teams and have people fight over what the padding should be or whatever? Or is this just sort of more working on your own?
I've used it on a couple of projects so far, and they've both mainly been on my own. So yeah, that is something to think about, how you don't trip over each other and get lots of merge,
Well, it's also just inconsistencies, because if some people like lots of white space and others don't, and you're working on different parts. Yeah. It's almost easier if you're setting variables in SAS to enforce one or the other.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. That's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, you need to think about that. How do you enforce these kind of style guide type issues?
I suppose you could say use that example of purging out the classes that you don't need or don't want.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Kind of streamline it down to what your guidelines are or standards.
Yeah, I think so. I'm struggling to think of a way that you might be able to do something kind of SAS-like and set the variables. Well, you've got your config file, so you can change the scale. So it's like padding 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. You could put some custom named padding variants in there.
When you go to the other option you've got there, where you're creating the component styles, but using the apply method to make that a lot easier. But when they're actually applied, you've got a definition of what a button should be like.
Yeah.
And so that's what people use.
Yeah, that sounds like a way to solve it. I haven't come across this yet, so yeah, there's still some things to consider, definitely.
When you were using the little sort of tailwind.run Django, I can imagine in certain circumstances it can start feeling like you're just putting the same classes in over and over and over again, even though they're on totally different or seemingly totally different things. How have you found that generally when you've been using it? Does it sometimes feel a bit of a drag, or do you have particular tricks you use?
I haven't found it to be too bad. You're helped by the fact that you've got like loops and things in Twig. So, if there's multiple items, you're only really adding the class once. and everything's quite self-contained. You know, if something's reused a lot, then you should probably be making like a paragraph type for it or something, and you know, adding that paragraph in multiple places, or yeah. So it hasn't come up as a big issue.
And to be fair, it's not like you don't get that feeling when you're writing lines of CSS rules.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly.
No sign of a WYSIWYG editor to do all the classes for you yet.
I mean, I guess that's something that does strike me as quite a nice one with WYSIWYG, is that because you can define your set of classes, you let them paste it, like apply. That sort of sounds like it would play quite nicely.
Yeah, you could still have your styles in the WYSIWYG, your style drop down that just adds a class. It would still work, yeah.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned Laravel. I mean, obviously in the context of Tailwind, but I've been doing a lot of Laravel stuff recently. While maybe a couple of years ago I'd been much more semantic classes. It's like, yeah, py4 done. It's yeah. So this does have a lot more appeal than it might once have to me.
Well, certainly as to the same way of doing it and getting completely different designs out the other end. So if you've got to work with a large range of designs for different clients, to be able to work in the same class names, the same way to achieve that, and just learn the one method, I think has great benefits when you Drupal shops that have that sort of range.
Yeah, it's one of the big benefits for me, because even projects that it's just been me coding it, there's, you know, with CSS it's evolved and you're in a different mind space when you work on each one, so they're even still a bit different. But with Tailwind, you just know what the classes are going to be, so it's very, very good in that regard. I don't want to hold you back from the pub.
Any others with questions before we sort of wrap it up? Maybe they've all gone to the pub already.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for.
John, thank you.
No problem. I'll stick the slides up on. I'll put them in the Drupal Slack group, the general Drupal Slack group, in case anyone wants to refer back. And this has actually been recorded as well, so we can put the recording up in there too.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.